They said she was too fat to be chosen, too pious to be wanted. When her mail-order groom never arrived, the town spat on Sarah-Beth and cast her into the wilderness like spoiled meat. But high in the Montana ridge, a man no one dared speak of found her silent, scarred, and watching. He was no groom, no gentleman, and no sinner either. Some say he'd never touched a woman. Others say he'd once lost everything. Why did this feared mountain man take her in? And what happened when a forgotten woman met a man with nothing left to lose? When a silent man opens his door and a broken woman dares to hope again, one question echoes through the mountains. Was it fate or something deeper that brought them together? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like this still matter because they remind us who we are when the world forgets. If you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and the kind of love that heals more than it takes, then you belong here. Let me know which state you're watching from and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that bind us back together. The sun was merciless above the dusty sprawl of Graythorn, Utah, baking the red dirt road into cracked leather beneath leather shoes and judgmental eyes. The townsfolk gathered like birds around a carcass, silent but watchful, as Sarah-Beth Callister stood on the wooden platform outside the meeting house. Her dress clung unkindly to her frame, soaked with sweat and shame, while her hands clenched a small tin box to her chest as if it were her last anchor to dignity. It was. The bishop stood beside her, tall and pale, his gray beard twitching as he read from a paper folded so many times the corners had worn thin. His voice, sharp and ceremonial, echoed off the clapboard buildings. The groom sent for Sister Sarah-Beth has not come, nor has he written. Such silence, in the eyes of the Lord, is answer enough. No one spoke. A fly buzzed. Somewhere, a horse stomped. Sarah-Beth dared not lift her head. She felt the eyes, some pitying, most not burning into her back like midday sun. She had written the man in earnest, responded to his letters with prayerful hope, and believed herself worthy of love, even in the face of whispers that called her foolish, unseemly, a burden on any righteous man. The bishop had promised the match, and now he was dissolving it in front of everyone. She shall not remain under the church's provision, he declared. The Lord chastens those he loves. It was then that someone young, likely, emboldened by the crowd, snorted. Another whispered. A woman gasped, whether in dismay or satisfaction, Sarah-Beth could not tell. Her cheeks burned hotter than the sun. She blinked hard, willing herself not to cry. Crying would only prove them right. 2 elders escorted her down the platform. They didn't touch her. That was part of the shame. A small handcart sat nearby, loaded with a threadbare blanket, a canteen, a sack of flour, and a Bible. Nothing more. No horse, no coin. The tin box in her hands held her letters, the ones she had written, the ones she had never dared send, and the ones that had made her believe a man in Montana wanted her. She had copied scriptures inside them, added pressed flowers, sealed them with wax from the church candles. Now they were all she had. She began to walk. Not one person stopped her. The road out of town was long and winding, bordered by brush and rock, and the occasional pine that offered no shade. Her feet ached within the hour. Dust clung to her skirt and ankles like shame reborn. Somewhere behind her, a child called out her name, but no parent followed. The breeze carried voices, a woman remarking on her size, a man saying she'd eat through her rations by nightfall. Sarah-Beth kept walking. Her breath came heavy, but her eyes stayed forward. The wilderness yawned ahead. It was not empty, not truly. It held the scent of pine sap and sage, and in it there was space, cold and indifferent though it might be. Better that than the heat of cruelty dressed in Sunday clothes. Her steps slowed only when the town disappeared behind a ridge. Alone now, she stopped, turned once, and looked back. No one followed. No one ever would. The land stretched before her, like an open wound raw, endless and silent. The road vanished within a day, swallowed by uneven terrain and whispering sage. Sarah-Beth dragged her handcart through scrub and stone, the wooden wheels groaning under the weight of her meager belongings and her heavier fears. The wilderness offered no path, only resistance. Thorn bushes scraped her arms, the sun flayed her neck, and the wind was no companion. It howled like judgment, cold at night and cruel by day. Her legs ached beneath her wide frame, and her breath came in hard sobs that she tried to quiet with prayer. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow," she murmured more than once, but even the familiar scriptures felt like echoes in a canyon heard but unanswered. Hunger arrived on the second day, sharp and immediate. She rationed the flour into a thin paste, swallowing it dry with water that grew warmer by the hour. On the third day, the canteen was nearly empty. She licked dew off a stone that morning, like a dog. At night, the darkness came alive. Coyotes howled in the distance. Strange noises crackled from the underbrush, and once something brushed the side of the cart while she slept beneath it, sending her bolt upright with a scream that startled even herself. The sky above, black and endless, seemed to press down on her, a lid over a box she couldn't escape. In her dreams, she heard the bishop's voice declaring her unworthy, and in some cruel trick of the mind, she saw the groom, a man she had never met, laughing as he burned her letters one by one. She woke crying more than once, and always alone. Each day, the landscape changed, but never softened. Jagged rocks jutted like broken bones from the ground. Dust turned to coarse gravel, then to steep inclines. Pines gathered thickly as she neared the highlands, their shadows long and watchful. The air grew thinner, her legs trembled. The wheel on the cart cracked at some point she didn't notice when, only that suddenly it dragged sideways, and she could no longer pull it. She left it behind. The tin box she carried in her arms now like a child clutched close, guarded even in sleep. The letters within had grown heavy, as if their pages soaked up her shame. Her lips were cracked, her voice gone. She hadn't spoken aloud in over a day. When the fall came, it was quiet. She stepped wrong on a patch of moss-covered stone, and her ankle twisted beneath her. The world tilted. The box fell. She landed on her side. The wind knocked from her lungs, her body refusing to rise. The sky above turned silver, dusk claiming the ridgeline. She lay there heaving, chest rattling with each breath. Her dress was torn, her hair matted with twigs. The letters spilled across the moss like lost prayers. Then something shifted in the trees. Not a coyote, not wind, a presence. A shadow tall and unmoving, half swallowed by pine and fog, broad-shouldered, still as a stump, watching. Sarah-Beth couldn't run, couldn't scream, could barely lift her head. The last sound she heard before the dark took her again was the heavy crunch of boots on forest soil, moving slowly toward her. The first thing she noticed was the smell, wood smoke, damp wool, and something yeasty and warm. Sarah-Beth stirred beneath a coarse quilt, her body aching from ankle to collarbone. Her eyes fluttered open, lids sticky with sleep, and met the low flicker of lamplight against rough-hewn logs. The room was small, unevenly built, with a ceiling so low she could almost touch it if she tried. Wind howled faintly through the chinks in the walls, but the fire burned steady in the stone hearth. She wasn't dead. Her mouth tasted like copper and silence. She shifted, groaning. Her wrist was wrapped. A folded cloth rested on her forehead. The tin box sat nearby, closed and untouched. Beside it, on a wooden stool, sat a piece of bread, thick-crusted, lumpy, dark, still warm. She could smell the rye. "Who?" she began, but her voice cracked apart like dry clay. She coughed, then tried again. "Who brought me?" From the corner, something moved. A man stood in the shadows. So still she had not seen him there before. His face was half hidden beneath a thick beard, more iron than brown, and hair that hung past his collar like it hadn't known scissors in years. His clothes were mismatched hide and wool, stitched with sinew and wear. His arms were crossed. His eyes, beneath the shadow of a heavy brow, watched her with a sharpness that struck deeper than any words. He said nothing. Sarah-Beth froze, hand halfway to the bread. He didn't blink, didn't step closer. For a moment she thought maybe he was just another vision, like the ones she'd imagined in fevered dreams of rescue. But then he reached to the table, took a small tin cup, and set it gently beside the bread. Water sloshed inside. "You found me," she whispered. The man gave a single nod. "You brought me here?" Another nod. "Why?" He stared at her a moment longer, then turned without a word and walked out the door. It creaked closed behind him. The cold rushed in briefly, and with it the scent of pine and smoke and something else, wildness. She lay back against the pillow, the warmth of the fire a fragile thing against the storm of thoughts in her head. He hadn't touched her, hadn't said a word, and yet he had built the fire, bandaged her wrist, and brought her food. She picked up the bread. It was dense and coarse, but sweet on the inside. Molasses, maybe. She ate slowly, every bite grounding her to the moment. She had lived. Outside, a hammer struck wood. Then silence. Then another strike. Rhythmic. Intentional. By the second day, she learned his name. It was carved into the handle of an old axe leaning against the hearth, e.g., Holt. And later, when he returned from the woods carrying a haunch of venison and found her on her feet, he met her gaze only long enough to say, in a voice so low and hoarse it barely counted as speech, "Elias." Then, nothing more. She learned his rhythm without needing words. He rose before dawn, chopped wood, hunted, mended traps. He left her food, bread, berries, the occasional strip of jerky. He never came too close. And yet, she never felt watched, only noted, as though her presence was being measured, not judged. In Graythorn, they had whispered about a mountain man gone mad, a man who lost everything in a fire and took to the forest like a wolf. But wolves devoured. Elias left bread. Days passed with the measured patience of a ticking clock, though no clock ticked in the cabin. Sarah-Beth marked time by the light that filtered through the smoke-darkened window and the quiet thud of Elias's boots on the porch each morning. He left before dawn and returned by dusk, always alone, always silent. Sometimes he came back with game slung over his shoulder, sometimes with firewood, once with a broken trap and blood on his sleeve. He never explained. She never asked. The pain in her ankle faded into a dull ache. She could walk now, slowly, leaning on a cane Elias had left near the hearth carved from pine and sanded smooth. No words had accompanied the gift, only its quiet presence, as if it had always belonged to the space between them. Sarah-Beth began to move through the cabin in careful steps, taking in the cluttered corners and the long neglected shelves. The place was built for one man, and a lonely one at that. Dust blanketed everything. Mismatched boots sat by the door. Untouched books lay piled on the floor, and in the far corner, a blanket half covered an old spinning wheel, broken and abandoned. She saw no signs of a woman's touch, not even a faded ribbon or a teacup, just hard living and older grief. She didn't know what gave her permission, only that no one stopped her. She began with the hearth, sweeping out the ashes and building a fresh fire. Then the floors, each creaky board scrubbed on her hands and knees with a rag and warm water. Elias said nothing when he returned that evening, only paused in the doorway, a second longer than usual. His eyes passed over the cleaner floor, then flicked to her, but he said nothing, just nodded once, slowly, and went about preparing meat for drying. The next morning she found a clean rag folded neatly on the table. No note, no explanation. Each day she found something more to reclaim. A cracked window pane was patched with waxed cloth. A broken shelf was nailed back into place with tools she found in a box under the cot. She opened the shutters for the first time in years, letting light spill across the wooden walls. Dust danced in golden shafts. The cabin, once a dark tomb of routine, began to breathe again. In the evenings, when Elias was gone or outside, Sarah-Beth wrote. She pulled the tin box from under her cot and took out the letters. Not the ones she had received, those were few, but the ones she had written. Dozens, maybe hundreds. She read them aloud, softly, to the crackling fire. Some were prayers, some were desperate hopes. Most were written to a man she had never met, a man who would never arrive. But now, they were something else. Not longing, but remembering. She began to write new ones, not addressed to anyone, not even signed. Just thoughts, dreams, fragments of who she had been before shame settled in her bones. She wrote about the wind through the trees and the way Elias always kept his tools sharp, about the kindness of a man who never spoke but made sure her water was always fresh. The silence between them held weight but not fear. It was a silence that let her heal without pressure, without explanation. There was no one to impress, no need to shrink herself down. In that stillness, something inside her began to stitch itself back together. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, like a broken bird learning how to perch again. The cabin had not changed much, but it no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like mercy. The dog came first. Sarah-Beth had seen him watching her from the tree line, a wiry shepherd with one torn ear and a limp that gave him a slow, deliberate gait. His coat was dark as bark, matted in places, and his eyes held the same wary distance she'd first seen in Elias. For days, he circled the cabin at dusk and dawn, never barking, never approaching, just observing with the caution of something that had once known pain and remembered it well. She offered him bread on the third day. He didn't take it. On the fourth, she laid a strip of dried venison on a flat stone beside the porch and didn't look when she left it there. That night, it was gone. On the fifth, he sat outside the door as she swept the cabin, tail twitching, head tilted, closer than before. By the end of the week, Thorn lay stretched across the porch each morning, eyes half closed, breathing slow. She began to speak to him in the soft voice reserved for secrets and children, murmuring thoughts aloud as if he were meant to listen. "You're not so scary, Thorn," she said one afternoon, kneeling beside him with a bowl of water. "Neither's your master, if I'm honest." Thorn lapped from the bowl, then nudged his head against her palm. Elias saw, of course. He always saw. From the edge of the woods or behind a pane of glass, his eyes tracked every moment, but he never interrupted, never called the dog away, never said a word. The goats followed next. There were two of them, pale and scrappy, tied to a crooked fence near the shed. Their pen was little more than a circle of stones and loose wood. Sarah-Beth started bringing them scraps, carrot tops, apple cores, bits of crust. One morning, she caught the smaller one tangled in the fence, bleeding in panic. She rushed to it without thinking, heart racing, fingers fumbling against the knot. When it finally broke free, it bolted into her arms and stayed there, trembling. She rocked it gently, murmuring nonsense and scripture in equal parts. The next morning, both goats followed her to the porch like children after a mother. It was the hawk that startled her. She found it by accident, tucked inside a cage at the back of Elias's storage shed. One wing was bound with leather, feathers frayed and dulled. Its eyes burned gold as flame. She gasped when she saw it, stepping back instinctively. Then, slowly, she drew nearer, hands open, gaze low. "Beautiful thing," she whispered. "Why are you still here?" The hawk didn't answer, but it didn't strike, either. She began tending it daily, changing the water, feeding it slivers of meat. She learned not to flinch when it flared its wings. Over time, it let her touch the edge of its bandaged wing, and once, it turned its head to watch her with something like recognition. Elias stood behind her the first time she dared open the cage door and let the hawk perch on her forearm. She didn't hear him enter, only felt his shadow. When she looked up, he was leaning against the doorway, arms folded, silent. "I used to think he wouldn't survive," he said, voice low and brittle. Wound was too deep. Sarah-Beth glanced down at the hawk, still and regal on her arm. "Sometimes you just need time," she replied. Elias nodded once, slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he had long wondered but never asked. Then he turned and walked away. Nature, it seemed, had begun to make its judgment. The dog, the goats, the hawk, they knew something Elias wouldn't say, and Sarah-Beth barely dared to hope that life was returning to the cabin. Not with fanfare, not with great miracles, but with small trusts earned over long silences. And somewhere between bread crusts and healing feathers, Sarah-Beth began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she belonged. The days no longer bled together like bruises. They had shape now, a beginning, a middle, an end. Mornings came with the scrape of Elias's boots across the porch as he stepped outside to split wood. Sarah-Beth would stir not long after, the warmth of the hearth beckoning her to begin again. She took comfort in the smallest tasks, boiling water, folding blankets, grinding herbs she'd gathered with trembling fingers and aching knees. Her movements were slow but certain, and each motion stitched another thread into the fragile fabric of her new life. She cooked while he worked. It was never more than broth with potatoes or bread with the crusts too thick, but he ate everything she offered without complaint. She noticed how he paused when she laid the bowl down, as if waiting for her to speak or stop him. She never did, but he always nodded, a quiet grace, before taking the first bite. That was enough. At midday, they passed each other in brief exchanges. Elias brought in game or wood. She offered water or wiped blood from a pelt. Sometimes they sat in silence by the fire, the air thick with pine smoke and unsaid things. She began to hum not songs from her childhood, which now felt too far away, but simple melodies that rose from memory like mist. Hymns, lullabies, fragments. She hummed while kneading dough or stitching torn fabric, unaware until she caught Elias watching her one afternoon, his axe still in hand, not moving. He didn't say anything. He just listened. At night, when the cabin was lit only by firelight and the occasional pop of a spark, Sarah-Beth took out her tin box and read aloud. She never asked permission. She didn't need to. She spoke softly, her voice steady but unadorned, as she unfolded old letters, those she had once penned for the man she believed would love her. They were not always hopeful. Some were weeping prayers on paper, others careful dreams she dared to name. Some were just lists of things she wanted to remember. The color of sunset in winter, the taste of blackberry preserves, the way her mother used to braid her hair. She never turned to see if Elias listened, but she knew he did. He never sat inside during the readings. He stayed on the porch, cloaked in darkness, the glow of his pipe sometimes the only proof of his presence. She imagined him sitting with elbows on his knees, staring out into the trees while her words passed through the open door like a river through stone. One night, her voice cracked as she read a letter about a child she'd imagined having, a daughter with braids and questions and a laugh like bells. Her hands trembled. She paused. From outside, the creak of wood, a chair shifting, then the scrape of his boots retreating into the yard. She thought she'd pushed too far. But in the morning, she found a small carved bird on the table, whittled from pine, its wings open as if mid-flight. No note, no explanation. So she hummed that morning while she baked, and Elias, chopping wood beneath the high sun, turned his head ever so slightly, the rhythm of his axe matching her quiet tune. They never spoke of the routine. It simply became. Like the forest growing thick around them, like breath, like heartbeat, fragile, yes, but real. The morning was colder than most. A bitter wind had crept through the chinks in the cabin's walls, and Sarah-Beth wrapped herself in 2 shawls as she swept the kitchen corner, coaxing warmth from the stove with a few extra logs. Elias had left before dawn, as usual, wordless and purposeful. She suspected he preferred the forest when his thoughts were heavy, and that morning he had carried his rifle instead of his traps. She had meant only to clean. The floor near the hearth had always seemed uneven, and that day curiosity nudged her hand beneath the rug. Her fingers caught the edge of something, a loose board, warped and poorly nailed. She lifted it slowly, dust billowing up into her face, making her cough. Beneath the floor was a trunk, old, iron-latched, covered in a thin layer of soot, like it had survived fire or been buried in memory. Her heart knocked once, sharply. She should have stopped, should have waited for Elias. But something deeper than curiosity pulled her forward. Maybe it was the silence between them, the questions left suspended in the air like drying herbs, or maybe it was the way he sometimes stared at the fire like it spoke a language only he understood. She pulled the trunk out, the wood groaning in protest. It was heavy with time. The latch gave way easily, the metal too old to resist. Inside were remnants of a life that had clearly ended long ago. A child's shoe, no bigger than her palm. A small, worn blanket, hand-stitched with tulips and initials she couldn't quite read. A woman's bonnet, singed on one side, the ribbon still tied in a neat, practiced bow. Beneath them, a bundle of letters bound by twine, unopened, and at the very bottom, a charred family Bible, its corners curled like autumn leaves. Sarah-Beth did not cry, but she sat still for a long time, hands resting on her lap, the smell of smoke faint but unmistakable. The door slammed open. She turned too quickly, startled, the bonnet still in her hand. Elias stood in the doorway, face wild with wind and something older rage, not at her, but at the world. "What are you doing?" he barked, his voice a thunderclap in the quiet cabin. She began, rising slowly. "I didn't mean—" His eyes dropped to the trunk, then to her hands. Then he staggered backward, as if struck. He crossed the room in 3 steps, not to grab her, not to shout again, but to kneel beside the trunk like a man visiting a grave. His hands hovered over the blanket, his breath caught, and then he broke. Not with violence, but with grief. He covered his face with both hands and sank to the floor, his shoulders trembling. The sound that escaped him wasn't a cry, it was deeper, rawer, the kind of sound people make when mourning something they still blame themselves for. "They were mine," he choked, not looking up. "My wife, my little girl." Sarah-Beth knelt beside him slowly, not touching him, not speaking. "The fire took the whole street," he said, voice hoarse. "I tried to stop it, warned the council. They said I was mad, said I was trying to stir unrest because of the railroad deal. I should have done more. I should have broken the law if I had to. They locked me up that night for trespassing on town land, kept me in the jail while it burned." He looked at her then, eyes bloodshot, beard wet with tears. "They died screaming, and I wasn't there." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent, sacred. Sarah-Beth, hand still clutching the edge of the bonnet, placed it gently back into the trunk. Then she closed the lid, not to hide it, but to let it rest. "You didn't leave them," she said softly. "The town did." Elias didn't answer, but his silence for once was not a wall. It was a door, and something behind it slowly, painfully, had just begun to open. The fire cracked low in the hearth, casting long shadows along the cabin walls. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, but inside, the world had grown very still. Elias sat in his usual place by the fire, pipe untouched in his hand, gaze fixed on the glowing embers like they contained a map only he could read. Sarah-Beth sat across from him, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, her hands curled around a warm tin mug more for comfort than thirst. He hadn't spoken since the trunk. Not really. He'd disappeared for hours after, returning only as the sun dipped behind the ridge, face streaked with dirt and the kind of silence that wore like armor. But now, something in the way he sat shoulders low, hand loose, suggested he was ready to speak, if only once. "When I came to Graythorne," Elias said, voice low and worn, "I wasn't a recluse. I was a carpenter, a husband, a father. I had a small house, a good name. That's what they gave me when I left the army, some land, and the promise that I could start over." Sarah-Beth said nothing, only watched him, the light playing gently across the ridges of his face. "There were whispers about a rail company," he continued, "men with soft hands and sharp suits, offering gold for land that had once belonged to the tribes, promises to bring trains through our valley to make the town rich. But the terms, they were poison, hidden clauses, permanent damage. The line would cut through homesteads, destroy the water table." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I went to the council, preacher, sheriff, even the bishop. No one listened. They said I was stirring unrest, said I was trying to derail God's blessing." His lip curled slightly, but there was no humor in it. "I took the proof to the printing press, tried to get it printed. That's when they arrested me, claimed I trespassed, that I'd broken into the county office." He drew a shaky breath. "They held me overnight. My wife Emmeline, she was home with our daughter Ruth. Ruth was only 6. I begged the deputy to let me out, begged him, but he wouldn't. That night, someone set fire to the street. Started at the press, moved fast. My house went up before I even saw the flames from my cell." Sarah-Beth pressed the mug to her lips, but didn't drink. "They say I screamed so loud the locks shook that I nearly broke down the bars with my bare hands. By the time they let me out, there was nothing left but cinders and ash, and a crowd already whispering that maybe it was my fault, that I'd brought it on us." He looked up then, eyes searching hers, as if expecting to see the same suspicion reflected back, but she only held his gaze, steady and open. "I didn't have it in me to fight anymore, so I didn't. I disappeared into the highlands. Let them talk. Let them say what they needed. I kept to myself until he stopped. Until I stumbled across a woman, unconscious, halfway frozen, and clinging to a box full of letters like it was life itself. Thanks for watching, and Sarah-Beth felt her throat tighten. I didn't know what to do with you, he said. Didn't think I had anything left in me worth giving. But every morning I saw you breathe. It did something I thought I'd buried with them. He tapped the ash from his pipe, then finally lit it. The first puff curled toward the ceiling like a spirit rising. You're the first thing I haven't run from, he said. Sarah-Beth looked down at her hands, then back at him. The fire between them no longer flickered with mere warmth. It pulsed with truth, with sorrow, and with the first glimmer of something neither had dared name. You didn't save me, she said softly. You just opened the door. I walked in. Elias said nothing, but the nod he gave her was not one of agreement. It was something closer to reverence. The wind came without warning, like a hand flung open by heaven itself. The morning had been calm, blue sky stretched taut above the ridgeline, the pines still and whispering low as if in prayer. Sarah-Beth had taken the tin box outside to sit on the porch, the sun warming her shoulders through the shawl, the letters fanned out across her lap like fallen petals. She had begun to sort them by season, not for any reason except the quiet pleasure of it. She didn't hear the gust coming. One moment, she was tucking a letter beneath her elbow. The next, the wind snatched it, then another, and then the whole stack flew up like startled birds. Pages lifted into the air, some spiraling high, others tumbling across the clearing toward the trees. No, 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 she cried, stumbling to her feet, arms reaching in every direction. Her ankle, still tender, gave a small throb as she moved, but she paid it no mind. The letters were hers, years of thoughts, prayers, confessions no one had ever heard. She chased one down near the goat pen, another caught on a bramble, the torn corner flapping wildly. From the side of the cabin came heavy footsteps. Elias appeared with his coat half-buttoned and eyes narrowed against the dust. He didn't ask, didn't speak. Just dropped the armful of firewood he'd been carrying and started after the pages, moving with the sure-footedness of someone who knew how to track elk in a blizzard. Sarah-Beth watched him dart toward the tree line, snatch a sheet that had caught in a low branch, then another from the rocks near the stream. His movements were swift but careful, and somehow reverent. When they finally reconvened on the porch, breathless and coated in grit, he handed her a bundle of recovered pages without meeting her eyes. But one was still in his other hand, half-folded, crumpled at the edges. I didn't mean to read it, he said gruffly, almost apologetically. It opened when I picked it up. Sarah-Beth looked down at it, heart tightening. The page was one she remembered well. The ink was faded but legible, the lines short and uneven, written during a night of deep sorrow 2 winters ago. Elias cleared his throat, then read it aloud in a low voice, not mocking or curious, just humbled. Dear Lord, I no longer ask for a husband. I no longer ask for thinness or beauty or praise. I ask only to be seen, to be needed for more than my cooking or my silence. I want a life that matters. I want dignity before you, even if the world forgets me. He paused. His eyes, when they lifted, were no longer guarded. Sarah-Beth stood still, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the page. I wrote that, she said softly, after the bishop told me my weight was a sign of spiritual weakness. Elias didn't flinch, but something in his expression shifted like a door long nailed shut had groaned open just a crack. I see you, he said. The words hung in the air, simple and solemn. They carried no romance, no rush of emotion, just truth, solid and quiet like the mountain beneath them. Sarah-Beth blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Instead, she reached down, picked up the last stray letter from the porch floor, and tucked it gently into the tin box. The wind had scattered what was once private, but what returned to her was something different, something witnessed. And in Elias's eyes, for the first time, she saw not pity, not obligation, but recognition. Graythorne had always been a town of whispers, but when word reached the chapel steps that Sarah-Beth Callister was not only alive but living in the highlands with the man they called the Mountain Devil, the whispers turned to snarls. It was a drifter who brought the news, a trapper from the northern ridge who'd traded pelts at the general store and spoke carelessly over cider. Saw her with my own eyes, he said. Fat girl with fire in her eyes. And Holt, he didn't chase me off, just stared, like he was daring me to speak. The news rolled through town like a kicked hornet's nest. The bishop sat in the meeting house with his fingers pressed together, elbows resting on his Bible like it was a gavel. He was not a man accustomed to losing control. His sermons were ironclad, his punishments sharp, his words held as law among the devout. Sarah-Beth's disappearance had been a small inconvenience, quickly buried beneath scripture and shame, but now her name rose again, not in sorrow but in defiance, and that could not stand. He summoned the elders, men who owed him favors, men who feared losing their place in his favor. They sat around the long wooden table like soldiers at war council, nodding as the bishop unfolded his concern. "She's gone feral," he said, "living in sin with a beast of a man, a known criminal, a heretic. Holt turned his back on the church long ago. Now she does the same. What message does that send to our daughters?" One of the younger elders shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The bishop tapped a knuckle on the table. "It's our duty to bring her home. She's a lost lamb, and she's carrying secrets, letters, maybe even false accusations against this church. If left unchecked, she'll stain the cloth." He did not say it aloud, but all present understood. This wasn't about salvation, it was about control. The bishop had made her humiliation public. If she rose from it stronger, if she lived beyond the shame he cast, then others might begin to question where his authority ended. By the next morning, 3 men rode out toward the highlands, broad-backed, grim-eyed, with church badges pinned to their lapels. Not lawmen, not quite, but in Graythorne, the church's word outweighed the sheriff's. They carried a writ, handwritten and stamped with wax, calling for the return of a lost sister to her righteous path. Sechenju. They also carried rope. As they rode, dust rose behind them like smoke, and in the quiet hush of their passing, townsfolk whispered, "She's alive?" With Holt, she was always too proud. Thought her kindness was strength. The bishop stood outside the meeting house, watching the horizon as if expecting fire. He dressed in full vestments, gold thread glinting against the morning sun, his collar stiff and clean, but his eyes held something colder than righteousness, fear wrapped in fury. He had banished her to break her. Now she was rising from the wilderness, not ruined but remade, and that threatened everything he had built. The smell of smoke came before the sight of it, sharp and acrid, curling through the trees like a warning whispered too late. Sarah-Beth was fetching water from the stream when she saw it, a thin column rising past the ridge, not gray like hearth fire, but orange and angry, biting at the blue sky. Her heart dropped. She dropped the pail and ran. By the time she reached the cabin, the edge of the forest to the south had begun to glow with heat. Flames licked low brush and dead pine needles, spreading deliberately in a jagged circle that arced toward the property line. Elias was already outside, axe in hand, not to swing but to watch. His face was a mask of stillness, but his hands trembled. Behind him, Thorn barked frantically, bounding between cabin and woods, unsure of where to guard. Then came the shout. Voices from beyond the ridge men, perhaps 2 or 3 laughing, commanding each other in curt tones. A crash of branches, the crackle of another flame igniting closer this time. Thorn bolted toward the sound before Elias could stop him. A gunshot split the quiet, not a warning shot, aimed, followed by a whimper that made Sarah-Beth's legs give out beneath her. She dropped to her knees, breath caught, eyes locked on the trees. Elias moved then not toward the gunman, not toward vengeance, but toward the dog. He found Thorn minutes later, bleeding from a gash across the hind leg, whimpering in pain but alive. He carried the animal back in his arms, shirt stained with red, jaw clenched so tightly Sarah-Beth feared it might crack. They worked quickly, dressing the wound with herbs and boiled cloth. Thorn licked Elias's hand once, then lay still, panting but breathing. The hawk, however, didn't survive. Its cage, stored in the back shed for shelter, had caught a burning branch. By the time they reached it, the wood was ash, the bird silent. Sarah-Beth knelt beside the ruin, hand pressed over her mouth. Elias stood behind her, smoke casting shadows over his face. He said nothing. His silence held more rage than a scream ever could. "They want us afraid," she said, rising slowly. They want us to run. Elias stared at the scorched tree line. They think I'm still the man who will hide. Sarah-Beth looked at him, eyes fierce beneath the soot. You're not. That night, while the fire smoldered and the goats huddled close to the cabin walls, they sat at the table and made a plan. Not to strike back, not to meet force with fury, but to walk into Graythorn on their own terms, with their heads high, their truths sharp, and their hands empty. They'll twist it, Elias warned. Say I corrupted you, that you've gone mad. Sarah-Beth met his gaze. Then let them see I'm not afraid. Let them hear my voice. He nodded, slowly. We go at first light. And so they sat together by the hearth, the space between them no longer filled with silence, but with purpose. The town had tried to smoke them out, to burn them down like brush in the way of progress. But all it had done was reveal what stood in the ashes, something not easily broken. They would not run. They would rise. They arrived in Graythorn just past dawn, their wagon silent on the cold dirt road, the town still cloaked in morning hush. Sarah-Beth sat upright beside Elias, her hands folded in her lap, her heart a steady drumbeat beneath her shawl. They looked neither left nor right as they passed the chapel, the post, the general store, all shuttered, yet watching. Curtains twitched. A dog barked once and was silenced by a voice too quick to be casual. The town was waiting, but someone else was too. Esther met them at the side of the old livery barn, her shawl pulled tight, a basket on one arm, her silver hair braided and pinned like it had been since the war years. Her back was crooked, but her eyes were keen, cutting through fog and lies in equal measure. Before Sarah-Beth could speak, Esther waved them inside the barn, gesturing like she would a mare in labor, swift, direct, unquestionable. Once the door was latched, she turned to them, and her expression softened only slightly. Thought I'd never see you again, girl, she said. You look stronger. Sarah-Beth swallowed. I am. Esther looked at Elias then, and for a moment something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or memory long buried. I held Emmeline's hand when Ruth came into this world, she said, and I watched fire take 'em both while the town locked you up. Elias's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Esther nodded, as though expecting his silence. They called it divine punishment, said you meddled in things above your station, but I always said it was greed and cowardice that burned those homes, not judgment. Sarah-Beth stepped closer, voice steady despite the tremble in her chest. The bishop sent men after us, burned the ridge, killed the hawk. Thorn nearly died. Esther's eyes hardened. He's grasping now. When a man like that loses grip, he turns violent. We came to tell the truth, Sarah-Beth said, to speak, out loud, what everyone's known and been too afraid to say. Esther studied her a moment longer, then reached into her basket and pulled out a wrapped bundle bread, boiled eggs, a flask of tea. You'll speak, she said, but not alone. I've lived here long enough to know which hearts are good and which just beat from habit. There's still some light in this town. I'll rattle it loose. Before either of them could protest, she opened the back door and stepped into the day like it owed her something. Her cane struck the road with purpose, and her voice, quiet but deliberate, began to murmur truths in ears that had grown deaf from comfort. To the blacksmith's wife, she spoke of the fire and the bishop's lie. To the preacher's daughter, she whispered of Ruth's death and Holt's innocence. At the grocer's porch, she mentioned Sarah-Beth by name and said, she didn't come back begging, she came back standing. As a Cordy. By sundown, a tremor moved through Graythorn, not fear, not yet defiance, but uncertainty. People began asking questions, quiet ones, careful ones, but questions nonetheless. Esther returned to the barn before nightfall, her shawl dusted with flour and smoke. You've stirred the hornet's nest, Elias said. She smiled, tired but fierce. Good. Maybe it'll sting someone worth the trouble. Then she turned to Sarah-Beth, her voice softening again. You have the truth. That's all you need. But truth alone is only fire. Let it burn through the right hearts, and it becomes light. Sarah-Beth nodded, a lump forming in her throat. For the first time since returning, she felt something like momentum, like the tide that once swept her out had turned its face toward shore. They weren't alone anymore. The roots of the town were shifting, and Esther, with her cane and her whispers, had struck the first blow. The next morning, the air in Graythorne tasted different. Not clean, not yet, but lighter, like the breath before a storm breaks, or the hush before a hymn. Sarah-Beth felt it as she stepped out of the barn beside Elias, the sun rising behind them, casting long shadows that no longer felt heavy. She stood taller now, not out of pride but release. Her shoulders, once curled by shame, no longer bore the weight of their whispers. Her hands, steady at her sides, no longer trembled. Elias walked beside her without looking at the buildings around them, but she could feel the tightness in his body, the way his jaw stayed clenched, the way his eyes moved too quickly. He didn't want to be here, not in this town, not on this soil that had once stolen everything from him. But he walked anyway. They moved quietly, not hiding, but not demanding attention either. They visited the mill, the schoolyard, the general store. They spoke only when spoken to, offering calm greetings, nods of recognition. Sarah-Beth returned a basket to the midwife's porch and left a note beneath a folded cloth of goat cheese and herbs. She helped a child pick up a dropped doll and handed it back with a smile. She asked no one to believe her. She simply made herself known again without apology. And slowly, Graythorne began to shift. It was the women first. Mrs. Hensley, from the bakery, who remembered Elias pulling her son from a ditch after a wagon accident, told the story aloud in the post office. "Carried him home like he was made of feathers," she said, hands dusted with flour. Didn't say a word, just nodded and vanished. Then came Old Man Briggs's daughter, who whispered that Holt once left winter meat on their doorstep years back when her father was sick and they had nothing. "We never knew it was him, till later," she confessed, eyes wide, voice hushed. "Pa called it a miracle. I think Holt just didn't want thanks." Children began waving at Sarah-Beth in the street. One boy offered her a pine cone. A girl said she liked her shawl. And the town began to talk in the open, not all at once, not with shouts, but in nods, in murmurs, in the way someone held a door just a little longer or passed a loaf of bread without charging coin. It wasn't a parade. It wasn't victory. But it was movement. And in Graythorne, movement was a kind of miracle. Inside the old meeting house, Elias and Sarah-Beth prepared. The bishop had called a public forum for the next day, a gathering of the faithful, he said, a show of order, of discipline, a chance to expose sin and reclaim the town's moral standing. But Sarah-Beth knew better. It was a last grasp at control from a man whose grip was slipping. They sat together on the edge of a bench, going over the few letters she planned to read. Not all, just the ones that mattered, the ones that bore truth like fire. Elias laid out a map, marked with the old train lines, the deeds he once tried to protect. He spoke little, but she saw the tension ease from his hands when she brushed his fingers. "You're not afraid?" he asked. "I was," she replied. "Then I realized I've already lived through the worst they can do to me." He looked at her, really looked, and something in his expression, part grief, part awe, shifted into quiet pride. Outside, the wind stirred dust along the road, and the bells of the chapel rang with a hollow clang. But the town no longer echoed them with blind obedience. It listened instead to other voices, softer, truer, voices that had long been silent. And those voices were gathering. They gathered in the town hall beneath a sky the color of slate, the clouds heavy with the kind of hush that came before revelation. Graythorne's chapel bell rang low, its sound echoing across the square as townsfolk filtered in, boots scraping against the floorboards, murmurs darting like nervous birds between them. The room smelled of old pine and pressed linen, a solemnness clinging to every beam. At the front of the hall stood a wide table draped in white cloth. Behind it, the bishop in his formal vestments, seated like a judge carved from stone. His hands were folded, Bible resting beneath his fingertips, his mouth tight with resolve and calculation. Two of his chosen elders stood at either side of him, their expressions blank, their posture rigid. On the far end of the room, Elias stood tall, arms crossed, eyes unblinking. Beside him, Sarah-Beth clasped a small stack of folded papers close to her chest. She wore her best dress, the dark blue one with the hand-stitched cuffs, and her hair was braided in two thick plaits down her back. She did not bow her head. She did not hide. The bishop rose, his voice smooth and resonant. Brothers and sisters, we gather today in a spirit of discipline and love to confront rebellion in our midst. A woman who abandoned the path laid before her, and a man who has long lived outside the law and light. He gestured toward Sarah-Beth with an open palm, almost tenderly. Sister Callister was offered a chance at redemption, a marriage, a home. She refused it. She now consorts with Elias Holt, a man known for lawless ways, for arson and pride, for unrepentant savagery. The crowd stirred. A few nodded. Others looked down. He hides behind grief, the bishop continued. But grief does not excuse corruption. This is not a trial of revenge. It is a return to order. A pause. A heavy one. Sarah-Beth, he said, step forward and renounce this man, and I will restore you to your place among us. Silence followed. Not stillness, there was breathing, whispering, shifting, but silence of will, of waiting. Sarah-Beth stepped forward. She did not renounce him. Instead, she laid the folded letters gently on the table before her, each one written years ago, never read, never heard. She looked into the bishop's eyes and then turned to the crowd. I came to this town asking only to be seen, to be valued, not weighed, to be heard, not handled. These letters are mine. They are not wicked. They are not shameful. They are honest. Her voice was steady. You told me to disappear. You said my worth came through obedience. But this man you call beast fed me when I was starving, carried me when I couldn't walk, never raised his voice or hand, and never lied to me. The bishop opened his mouth, but before he could speak, another voice cut in. Esther. She rose from the second row, cane in one hand, eyes gleaming. I was there when they buried Emmeline and Ruth, she said. I saw the chains on Elias's wrists while his house burned. I saw the council ignore his warning, and I saw this town call it God's justice. The hall stilled. All eyes turned. You can't take her back, Esther said, voice firm, because she doesn't belong to you, and neither does the truth. Then came the grocer's wife, speaking of Elias's quiet charity in winter. The baker, who remembered the boy Elias saved. A farmer's son, who had once seen Sarah-Beth teach a girl to read beneath the cottonwood tree. One by one, the quiet ones spoke. Sarah-Beth unfolded a final letter and read it aloud. Dear Lord, I ask not for a husband, but for a life of meaning. Let my voice be used, my body not shamed, and my spirit not crushed by those who speak in your name but carry no love in their hands. And knew the Simpland. The bishop paled, and in that moment the truth broke over the room like dawn through a shuttered window. No one shouted, no one cheered, but something in the air changed, authority shifted, not in noise but in weight. Graythorne had listened, and it would never hear the bishop the same way again. The clatter of hooves on hard-packed earth broke the stunned silence. Heads turned toward the open doors of the town hall, where a tall figure on horseback appeared against the dusty light. He wore no robes or badges of faith, only a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat with the brass star of the territorial marshal glinting at his chest. Behind him, 2 deputies rode in silent formation, their faces set, their hands near their holsters, not out of fear but duty. The bishop's mouth tightened. This is a house of God, he said sharply, trying to summon the righteous authority that had once silenced entire rooms, not a court of men. The marshal dismounted without answering. His boots rang hollow against the floorboards as he entered, the crowd parting before him like wheat before the wind. He reached into his coat and pulled out a stack of folded papers, bound with a red ribbon. My name is Marshal Avery Lane, he said, voice low but clear. By order of the territorial court, I bring charges against Bishop Thaddeus Rowell concerning fraudulent land transactions, illegal seizure of property, and the forging of marital intent documents in violation of state and ecclesiastical law. A gasp cut the air like a blade. The bishop stood frozen, lips parted, one hand on the Bible, the other twitching near his robes. This is slander, he said. I have done nothing that wasn't sanctioned by the church. These are lies, spread by a woman spurned and a man steeped in sin. Marshal Lane turned toward the crowd, eyes scanning the familiar faces of Graythorne's people. These charges are substantiated by testimony from 3 former councilmen, as well as by documents recovered from the Salt Lake archives. Included are letters signed in the bishop's own hand, reassigning ownership of disputed parcels to shell names, parcels later resold to the railroad under inflated terms. He profited while families were pushed out. Esther stood up slowly, one hand on her cane, and spoke without raising her voice. You sold our land for silver, then you blamed a grieving man and banished a girl who only wanted a home. The bishop looked around him, seeking loyalty, command, obedience, but found only eyes that no longer bowed. The elders who had flanked him earlier now shifted away, their silence no longer safe. Even the children stopped whispering. They just stared. Sarah-Beth stepped forward, the letters she had read still clenched in her hand. You didn't just try to silence me, she said. You tried to erase me. Marshal Lane gestured to the deputies. He'll be taken to the district court for trial. Effective immediately, Thaddeus Rowell is removed from all ecclesiastical authority within this territory. The bishop opened his mouth once more, but no words came. Only the rustle of his robes and the metallic click of the shackles being placed around his wrists. The room remained silent until he was led out into the street, where the townspeople followed, not in outrage, but in the kind of watchful quiet that marked the end of a long delusion. No one wept, no one protested, and in that hush, something new began. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Sarah-Beth. Is that her? The woman nodded. That's the one who came back. Elias stood behind her, not as a protector now, but as an equal, shoulder to shoulder. Vindication hadn't arrived with noise or vengeance. It had ridden in with paper and quiet justice, and it had left the town changed. Where shame had once reigned, truth now stood, not loud, but unshakable. The bishop's house came down plank by plank, not with dynamite or fire, but with hands calloused, deliberate, and many. It stood for decades as a symbol of fear and control, perched on the hill above Graythorne like a watchtower, made of sermons and shame. Now, in the clear light of morning, it gave way beneath crowbars, hammers, and the quiet determination of a town trying to make itself right again. The first board was pulled by Esther. She didn't ask permission. She just marched up the front steps with her cane and pried it loose with the claw end of a borrowed hammer. When the wood groaned and splintered, the townspeople watching below let out a breath they didn't know they'd been holding. Then others followed. Men who had once trembled beneath the bishop's gaze now passed beams hand to hand. Women removed window panes and wrapped the glass in cloth for reuse. Children ran through the empty halls, laughing, unafraid. The building didn't resist. It seemed almost eager to be unmade. By sundown, the outline of the house was gone, and in its place was a clearing that smelled of dust and old wood, and faintly of something new. Sarah-Beth stood at the edge of the rubble, sleeves rolled to her elbows, skirt dirtied, and her hair pulled back in a braid. She pointed to the corner where the pulpit had once stood and said, "That's where the chalkboard should go. So the morning light comes in while they write." No one questioned her. The school was her idea, proposed with quiet confidence the day after the bishop was taken away. "We need a place for the children to learn," she had said. Not just to obey, to ask, to imagine. And the town had nodded, slowly at first, then with swelling agreement. Elias offered the first beams from his mill. He hauled lumber with two of the older boys and began teaching them how to shape it, how to sand the grain smooth, how to square a joint without splinters, how to build something that would last. Good wood doesn't fight you, he told them. It just needs to be listened to. Each afternoon, the boys returned to the cabin in pairs, their hands blistered, their eyes bright. Elias taught with few words but steady patience. He never raised his voice. He never mocked a mistake. In a town once ruled by harshness, his quiet steadiness became a kind of gospel. Sarah-Beth opened the cabin to the girls. She spread blankets on the floor and taught them letters, helped them sound out words, showed them how to string sentences into thoughts. Some had never held a pencil. Others had been told learning was a man's world. She gently unspooled those lies and replaced them with courage. "Every story you write," she told them, "is proof you exist." One day, a child brought her a bouquet of wildflowers and called her Miss Beth. Why forces? That evening, the girls helped her hang the first sign, Ridge School, Est, this year of grace. The cabin changed, too. Once a refuge for two souls in hiding, it now bustled with purpose. Goats grazed nearby. Thorn slept on the porch. Laughter filled the air where silence once ruled. A garden began to grow by the side-wall rows of beans, squash, and sunflowers, planted with small hands and big hopes. The place where ashes once lay had become a foundation, not of power, but of healing. And from that foundation, Graythorn began to rise. Not in size, not in wealth, but in dignity, in shared work, in kindness. It had taken fire to burn away the rot, but it took mercy to rebuild. The earth was soft beneath their hands, warm from the sun and dark with promise. Sarah-Beth knelt in the soil beside Elias, sleeves rolled up, skirt pinned just above her boots. A row of tiny green shoots peeked from the turned dirt, onions, carrots, beans. She pressed her fingers gently around a sapling tomato vine and leaned back to admire the even lines they had made. "I think we've done it straight this time," she said, brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek. "Or straighter than last week's row." Elias squinted toward the ridge, where the garden stretched along the slope behind the cabin. "Straight enough that a rabbit won't care," he replied, deadpan. She snorted, then laughed softly, the sound catching him off guard. Her laughter wasn't the high-pitched kind or the kind meant for approval. It was low, breathy, unself-conscious, real. Elias looked at her then not just as the woman he had carried through the woods, or the voice that filled his cabin with soft hymns and steady truths, but as herself. Her cheeks were pink from sun, her arms dusted with soil, and in her hair, tied neatly above her braid, was a ribbon sky blue, fluttering slightly in the breeze. He'd never seen her wear anything like it before. "New?" he asked, nodding toward it. She reached up and touched the bough as if surprised it was still there. "Found it in the old sewing tin. Thought it might be time." "For what?" She smiled. "For letting myself feel pretty." Elias didn't answer right away. He dug another hole, carefully placed a squash seedling, and covered it with soil. When he spoke again, it was quiet, almost careful. "I haven't kissed anyone since Emmeline." Sarah-Beth's hands paused in the dirt. She didn't turn her head, only looked out toward the horizon, where the pines swayed in the wind and the valley breathed slow beneath the sky. "I know," she said, the words gentle. He set his trowel down. "I don't say that looking for pity. I didn't take it that way." He looked at her then, straight on. "I thought, for a long time, that part of me was buried with them, that if I let it rise again, it meant forgetting." She turned toward him, eyes soft. "And now?" he exhaled. "Now I think it might mean remembering differently." Sarah-Beth stood slowly, brushing off her skirt, her ribbon catching a ray of sunlight as it fluttered again. She walked the short distance to where he knelt and extended a hand. "I've never been kissed in a way that meant something," she said. "Not once. Not ever." He rose, taller than her, hands rough and unsure. He looked down at her for a long moment, searching her face, not for permission, he already had that, but for peace. And he found it. He leaned in slowly. No urgency, no demand. Their foreheads touched first, and then their lips, soft and hesitant, like the petals of a bloom, unsure if spring had truly come. The kiss held no fire, no frenzy, just a deep, aching tenderness that had waited years to take form. When they parted, neither spoke. They simply looked at the garden, at the ridge, at the life growing beneath their feet. And then, without fanfare, they began to plant again, side by side, hands in the earth, hearts laid bare like seeds in spring soil, ready for what would come next. The ridge glowed gold beneath the setting sun, the valley stretching out like a painted quilt, patches of forest, pasture, and dirt road all stitched together with light. The cabin behind them was alive with the low, familiar noise of evening. Laughter from the porch, goats rustling in their pen, children running barefoot across the path, calling out to one another as supper cooled on the windowsills. Sarah-Beth sat on the bench Elias had built from pine and fitted with smooth, wide planks. The blue ribbon still wound through her braid, though now it was faded and worn soft from wear. She kept it not for beauty, but for what it reminded her of that day they first planted something and believed it might grow. Elias joined her, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. His hands were calloused, cracked, but steady as always. His beard had gone more silver than brown, and the deep lines of grief once carved into his face had been softened by months of peace, of purpose. Together they looked down over the valley, the same place he once thought would hold only ghosts. Now it held life. A group of girls sat on a blanket nearby, writing in small journals Sarah-Beth had stitched herself. They glanced toward her now and then, seeking approval, and she nodded gently, encouraging them to keep going. Words, she'd taught them, were like seeds you never knew which would take root. On the other side of the clearing, Elias's boys gathered around the foundation of a new storage shed. They measured beams, argued about angles, and shouted for his opinion. He didn't answer right away, letting them wrestle through it before stepping in. He always said a man remembers what he builds himself. Thorn lay beside the bench, his once wounded leg healed into a dignified limp. A chicken pecked the ground near his paws. None of it disturbed him. Elias looked out over the land, his arms resting loosely on his knees. "Never thought I'd see all this," he said. "Not again." She tilted her head. "What quiet?" "No," he said, his voice rough and low. "Family." The word hung in the air like a bell rung gently, unexpected but true. Sarah-Beth turned to him, her smile warm, unguarded. "I never wanted a groom," she said. "That was just what they told me to want." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "I just wanted a place where I wasn't a burden, where I wasn't something someone settled for. I wanted to be useful, to be seen, to be wanted." She reached down, brushing her hand across the bench, feeling the grain of the wood, the life in it, and I found it. Elias didn't say anything right away. He only reached for her hand and took it in his own, rough fingers closing around hers like the final piece of something long unfinished. He didn't squeeze. He didn't need to. She was already there. Behind them, the cabin windows glowed amber with firelight and life. Inside, bread cooled on the counter. A half-written lesson lay open beside a child's drawing of a hawk flying over a ridge. And before them, the world rolled on, wild, wide, and good, not because it had changed, but because they had. Not bought, not chosen by someone else. Found. Together.